Chapter 15 of For 15 Years by Louis Ulbach. Translated by Elizabeth Warmley Latimer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15. The Verdict Reversed. The indictment told Roget nothing new. The legal particularity with which the circumstances were stated worried him. He turned as soon as possible to the depositions and cross-examinations of the witnesses. The personality of Jean Mortier seemed, for the first time, to stand forth out of the shadows in which, until then, it had been hidden from his view. Jean Mortier appealed to his good character, pleaded his poverty, his love for wife and child, thus defending himself, so far as Roget was concerned, more effectually than if he had subtly refuted the charges in the indictment one by one. Roget looked over the tops of his papers at Florence. She seemed to him to have in her simplicity a noble bearing, a part of her inheritance from the man whose spirit rose before him. He thought she must be very like her father. Though Emilienne's features, softened and refined, were decidedly those of her daughter, her likeness to both parents attested their close union. She had the sense of honor common to them both, their purity and innocence. Where had she been, poor little thing, while her father, Jean Mortier, stood up in the court before what is called the bench of infamy, and invoked his child's pure trust in him as something to be pleaded in his own defense? Did she stay, lonely and unhappy, with some woman in the neighborhood, waiting for her father to be acquitted and her mother triumphantly to return? Ah, thought Roget, if I only could have been her little companion then. He submitted the deposition of Pierre Mortier's notary, Monsieur Boisselot, to a careful examination. The reader may remember that its benevolent leaning toward the prisoner had told against him. The man whose mission it had been to make known to Jean Mortier, a few hours before the murder, the cruel way that fate had used him, the kind-hearted man who had witnessed Jean's deep sorrow, owned that he had from the first had a presentiment of evil, but he never dreamed of a murder, only of a suicide. Roget again trembled. Maitre Boisselot, as well as Madame Mortier, had had the same idea that Jean might commit suicide. This, which to the jury seemed a presumption against the prisoner, was to Roget quite the reverse. The shame of an unjust accusation, together with his actual ruin, had been enough to overwhelm him. His real crime of self-murder, which was not among the charges brought against him, challenged Roget's deep compassion. When he read the account of the pathetic scene where Jean called on his wife to testify in his behalf, and when Emilienne, stretching out her arms to him, responded by a proud assertion of her faith in him and of her love, Roget let two big tears drop on the newspaper. Florence saw them. She rose and softly drew near him. She was pale and trembling. She put one hand on Roget's shoulder and said in a voice that was almost a sob, "Don't you find anything? I was beginning to hope just now." Roget seized her hand, pressed it hard against his lips, and when she drew it back, cried eagerly, "Ah, how I love you!" These words were only a promise of pity. Florence responded in a trembling voice, "You frighten me." "Don't be afraid," stammered Roget. Then, without knowing exactly what he said, for he seemed to himself to be walking in a state of somnambulism, he went on, "It is I who have cause to be afraid. Let me go on." He let the girl's hand drop, and she went back to her seat. He resumed his reading. The name of his father again attracted his attention. The bailiff called to the witness stand Monsieur de Monterey, who, standing up before the court, swore solemnly to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. When children sit in judgment on their parents, their judgments are implacable. They accept the painful duty in the spirit of martyrdom, and feel it no sacrilege to distrust where distrust seems necessary. Roget said to himself with horror as his father began his evidence. "I wonder what falsehood he is going to utter." He said it in his heart. He did not mean it. It was involuntary. It will be remembered that at the trial, Gaston's testimony was in favor of the prisoner, but his sympathy, so far from gratifying Roger, was dreadful to him. The son had taken the measure of his father's unreliability. He saw exaggeration in his eager assurances that he believed in the innocence of the prisoner. The court had asked Monsieur de Monterey to give his impressions of the deceased and to repeat what he had said of him before the juge d'instruction. Gaston, with an embarrassment very perceptible to his son, repeated his impressions. He said that the man seemed coarse and fierce and very disagreeable. He undertook to picture the scene of the murder and all that he supposed might have taken place. Jean, according to him, ruined, cleaned out. The gambler had been so imprudent as to use this slang word, which is part of the jargon of the gambling table, had probably appealed to the generosity of a rough, brutal man. Repulsed, insulted, and jeered at, he had lost his head, and in a moment of anger and despair, as he brandished his cane, he had struck him. Roger uttered a cry and sprang to his feet. A flood of light poured in upon him. It was his father. His father, who, when no one had said a word about any weapon but a hammer, had used the word cane. A cane brandished over the head of the victim. All at once, Roger remembered a day when his father and mother had spoken before him of a cane with a handle very like a hammer. Only 48 hours ago, had not his father threatened him with a cane? And had not his mother, in wild terror, flung herself between them, when at once Monsieur de Monterey, ashamed of his anger, had almost apologized to his son? He remembered other things besides. Facts and suspicions that had been floating in his brain grew clear to him instantly. His memory seemed full of them. At his cry, Florence had started up and again came toward him. He heard her step, but with an almost angry gesture, so completely was he unconscious of what he was doing at that moment, he pushed her from him. He saw, instead of love, a vision of the past, frightful, threatening, full of horror. He wanted all his faculties to look at it, all his attention to be concentrated on it, for as the scene rose before him, a voice seemed to cry out from the columns of the newspaper and to be echoed by something in his own heart. He read the rest of his father's deposition standing. Jean Mortier's lawyer had caught up the word cane that escaped from Monsieur de Monterey and had used it in his argument to break down the hammer theory. He had tried to demonstrate the impossibility of killing a man with an instrument that had to be handled at such short range, the necessity of at least having the hammer fixed on a long handle to obtain the necessary swing. Yes, yes, cried Roger in his heart. That was it. It was a cane. It must have been a cane. He had the self-command to go on and finish his father's deposition. The reader will remember that it ended by a reiterated protestation from Gaston that he was ready to swear that he believed Jean Mortier to be virtually innocent. My God, cried Roger, dropping back into his chair. He felt that this affirmation of his father's was an additional baseness, whereas upon the trial it was looked upon as a proof of noble and generous feeling. Roger's agitation was so great, and the only conclusion at which he could arrive was so terrible, that he wanted to gain strength to bear it, even by strengthening his own horrible suspicions. He went on reading the paper. The medical experts testified after his father. It may be remembered that one of them demonstrated the possibility of murdering a man with a small upholsterer's hammer, and that the other, who was older, affirmed and demonstrated, on the contrary, that the impetus given by the swing, either of a long-handled hammer or a thin cane, would have been necessary to make wounds so deep as those found upon the body. Roger had nothing more to learn. He knew. The papers dropped from his hand and were scattered at his feet. The strange pricking sensation that runs through the body when subject to an electric current passed over him, and his fingers became rigid. The doors of his memory stood now wide open. His own boyish recollections poured a cruel flood of light upon the dreadful story. He saw a scene that had taken place between his father and mother 15 years before. He did not understand it at the time, and yet even then it had vaguely alarmed him. He saw himself in the salon of the little hotel in the Rue d'Anjou, a child in petticoats, standing by his mother's side, leaning on her knee. A servant came in, bringing a cane, whose handle was something very like a hammer. At the sight of that cane, Monsieur de Monterey had flown into a rage. He had seized it, broken it in pieces, and flung it into the fire. The boy, much astonished and distressed by seeing a thing he would have liked to own thus thrown away, had taken the tongs and tried to get it out of the fire. And Roger could remember his mother's sad voice saying, "Let it alone, my child. Your papa is right. It is better it should never be found." Yes, those were his own mother's words. Did she know then that the cane was important evidence? That afternoon he was with his mother alone. She had wept long and bitterly, and in his great pity for her he remembered that he had cried too, and had said, "Don't cry, my dear little mamma. He will never do so any more." From that day he could feel that his respect for his father had decreased, and that he had been a more tender boy in his behavior to his mother. Yes, that scene had left a deep impression on his mind, and now the wound it made was again opened and bleeding. In respect to that cane, he had been very naughty, or rather, he had really meant to help his mother. He wanted to carry out her wish that no one should ever find it. And next morning he had gone into the salon, knelt down before the hearth where the fire had not been rebuilt, and scratched in the cinders with his little nails until he found the metal handle of the cane, and put it in his pocket. Oh, how frightened he had been when he met his mamma at the parlor door. She had suspected nothing. She did not even notice his little dirty fingers. But he had told her a falsehood. How well he remembered that falsehood. It was his first, his only lie. He remembered another scene. One evening, after a long stroll in the Bois with his father, when they came home they found the drawing room a blaze of light. Monsieur and Madame de Monterey had then talked in his presence of the murder in the Bois de Boulogne, and as Roger heard them mention an upholsterer's hammer, he had asked what kind of a hammer that was, and his mother, in her grave, low voice, had answered him, "Something very like the handle of your papa's cane." Everybody had seemed disconcerted, and he was disconcerted most of all. For had he not picked that very handle out of the ashes, and was it not still hidden away? At first he had taken great pains to conceal it, putting it constantly in some new place, looking upon it as something he had no right to own. Afterward, when he became a schoolboy, he had kept it as a souvenir of his very early boyhood, though he could have given no good reason for the value he seemed to attach to the broken toy. He had it still, upstairs in his own chamber, in a corner of one of his drawers. He wanted to look at it again, to examine it, to see what it might reveal to him now. As he rose, he thought at first that he was going to fall. He could not make a step forward, but his sinews stiffened into steel. In another moment he could stand, and a moment afterward he found himself making his way to the door, moving stiffly like a ghost or like a man in armor. Florence, in her amazement, dare not stir. Warned by Roget's previous gesture not to disturb him, she sat motionless in her chair with her hands clasped before her. She could not understand Roget's state, but she did not wish to break in upon it. It seemed to her a sort of stupor inspired by amazement at the truth, which had suddenly been made plain to him. Roget apparently had forgotten her. He did not turn toward her. He walked straight to the door, quitted the parlor, leaving the door open behind him, and taking no notice of the papers lying on the floor. Florence distinctly heard his steps resounding on the staircase. His footsteps were heavy as he went up the stairs. It seemed as if he meant to let every one in the chateau know that he was going to his room. While he went slowly thus to his own chamber, thinking over everything connected with the object he was in search of, Florence rose and began looking at the newspapers and papers lying on the floor, but she found out nothing. She felt some scruples, too, about disturbing them, or even touching them. Her heart beat loudly. She glanced around her. Through one of the glass doors she saw her mother in the garden. She was tempted to rush to her, to call to her, to give her the first inkling of the surprise in store for her, to tell her of her anxiety, of her hopes, for it was evident to her that Roget must almost have arrived at the truth. But then she thought, why should I take from Roget the pleasure of announcing his discovery? He has shown so much zeal in making it. I must leave him the honor of our triumph. Emilienne, on her part, saw that her daughter was looking at her, but she waited, and would not appear to turn her head toward the white parlor. She curbed her impatience and anxiety by gathering rose leaves. The luncheon hour was at hand. The bell would soon ring, and generally 5 minutes beforehand the family would meet together in the garden, that the meal might not be kept waiting by the absence of any one of them. Monsieur and Madame de Monterey would, no doubt, soon join Madame Emilienne. That was another reason for Florence to wait, and not be treacherous to Roget. He was not long absent. She heard him coming down with the same step with which he had gone up the stairs. When he stood on the door-sill, framed by the woodwork of the doorposts, his face was livid, as if he had drunk poison. At this sight, Florence could not contain herself. She gave a scream and was rushing toward him. Roget put a finger on his lips to desire her to keep silence, and holding something in one hand tightly clasped, mute, eager, walking with an automatic step, which seemed to make his whole body move at every stride, he went toward the table where he generally sat when drawing, unless he was at his easel. A large sheet of drawing paper was always laid there, ready for his sketches. Roget laid down before it the thing that he was clutching in his hand, seized a pencil, and began to draw. It was strange to see a young man in such a state drawing something with precision, growing paler and paler as he worked, tearing his very soul in shreds, vivisecting it with the point of his pencil. First of all, in one corner of the big sheet of drawing paper, he sketched the thing that he had been up to his room to find. Then beneath it, with feverish skill, he drew a man in the act of striking another man with a cane, at the end of which was a handle exactly like a polished metal hammer, in every respect the shape and size of that of an upholsterer. The man in act to strike, though Roget had not consciously intended to give him that likeness, was unmistakably, fatally, like Monsieur de Monterey. Just as the drawing was being finished, the luncheon bell began to ring. Roget did not hear it. He was absorbed in the drawing. When he had ended, he stood with his eyes fixed on the work. His mouth was set and rigid as the dead. Florence had not moved. She had by this time as much fear as hope. She wanted to tell Roget that the bell had rung for luncheon. She saw her mother coming toward the room. She knew she would now surprise them. Gabrielle had come downstairs, and the voice of Monsieur de Monterey was heard, gaily calling for Roger. Roger heard him. That voice, sharp, forced, and falsetto, broke up his catalepsy. A gleam of wrath and passion shot from his eyes and suddenly gave place for a big tear. He left the table, but as he did so, he lost his strength, and staggering toward Florence, he dropped at her feet, seized her hands, dashed his head upon her lap, and burst into tears. "What is it?" asked the young girl. "If you can find out nothing, never mind." "I have found it. I have found it all," whispered Roger, lifting his head. "Thank you," said Florence, enchanted, comprehending nothing of his agony, believing only that his emotion was caused by the long strain, or that it expressed his strong sense of the sufferings of her innocent father, so long calumniated. "Thank you," she repeated lovingly, and bending over him, she pressed a long kiss on his hair. He drew back. It seemed sacrilege. He sprang to his feet with a cry of terror. What he saw was more than he was prepared for. Emilienne had come in quickly, had gone up to the table. With one glance she took in the drawing. She saw the little hammer-like handle of the cane. Without a word, without a cry, she had possessed herself of it, and of the drawing, and holding them aloft in her clenched hands, she rushed out of the room. Roger tried to stop her, but he was forced to lean one moment against the doorpost to save himself from falling. That moment enabled Emilienne to launch her thunderbolt. She rushed up to Monsieur and Madame de Monterey, who were standing together at the door of the dining room. With one hand, she touched Gaston on the elbow. He turned round toward her. She blazed with wrath and triumph. "Murderer!" she said hoarsely, with a ring in her voice which emphasized the word. Gaston had a sudden fit of epilepsy or apoplexy. He grew livid and staggered backward. Gabrielle placed herself before him, and pushing Emilienne away, cried, "You are killing him." "Why not? He has killed too," replied Emilienne. The eyes of the two women met. Their glances crossed each other. Jean Mortier's widow held up the little object that was like a hammer. "Look at it," she cried. "Do you know this?" Gabrielle staggered back in her turn, overcome by surprise and horror. Where could it have come from? Emilienne held up the drawing. "And that! Do you see that too?" she cried. Gabrielle glanced toward Roger, who had rushed into the room. He snatched the paper from the hand of Madame Emilienne, who made no resistance, and tore it into fragments. But when he wanted to take back the piece of metal like a hammer, she resisted and hid it in her bosom. "Will you kill me, that you may rob me?" she screamed out. "Son of a murderer!" Roger drew back abashed. Gaston seemed turned to stone, but his stupor was caused by a rush of blood to the head. He now dropped backward as if struck by lightning. His head crashed on the door-sill of the dining room, and blood began to flow from the wound. Gabrielle, unable to break his fall, threw herself upon her knees and tried to raise him. Roger also rushed to the assistance of his father. He caught Emilienne's eye as he passed her. "Thank you," she said in a sharp tone of anger and satisfaction. These were the very words that Florence had used to him a few moments before, and they were torture to him. Florence had stayed behind in the white parlor, bewildered and uncertain what to do, seeing imperfectly, not daring to understand, but dimly divining that she had set loose unwittingly some terrible misfortune. Her mother came up to her. "Let us go," she said. "What has happened?" The widow, without stopping, made a backward gesture with her hand as she walked on, and pointed to the group in the dining room. "There is the man," she said, "who killed Pierre and Jean Mortier." Florence trembled and bowed her head. Ah, I knew it! I always knew it! The widow repeated as, panting, she drew her daughter after her by the power of her passion, and they entered the detached part of the house where they lived. Florence followed her mother, overwhelmed but without resistance. When mother and daughter were in their own rooms, Emilienne flung on the table the little object like a steel hammer. "Look there!" she cried. "It was with that he struck Pierre Mortier. It is the handle of his cane. Poor Roger! Think no more of him. It is now his turn to suffer. He must drink the cup of shame that we have drunk for years. Pack up your things. No, that would take too long. Get your hat and let us go. We will not stay one moment longer under this roof." "Where are we going?" asked Florence. She shed no tears, for her mother's eyes were dry, but her voice had a touching tone of tenderness. "Where are we going? To find a magistrate, to bring the gendarmes to this house, and death with them. I think, mamma, that death has come already." Florence spoke softly, looking through the window from which she could see into the dining room. "Ah!" This exclamation came from Emilienne, who resumed in a less strident tone. "I did not expect such a punishment. The murderer accused, tried, sentenced, and executed by his own son. Vengeance is thine, O God." "Poor Roger!" repeated Florence, now beginning to cry. That second allusion to Roger troubled Madame Emilienne. She frowned. "We shall have time enough to pity him," she said. "You too, my child, have been an instrument to serve God's justice. You will suffer from it, but you must feel no remorse. It is your duty to avenge your father." 10 minutes after this, Madame Jean Mortier and her daughter left the Chateau de Hellepoix without knowing what was passing in the other part of the house, without another word to each other, or saying anything to the servants whom they met, who, frightened and bewildered, stood aside and saw them go. They had no idea where they were going, only that they must quit that house of murder. Emilienne walked on, proud, fierce, and resolute. Florence followed her with deep sorrow in her heart and something like remorse, but full of steadfastness and courage. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of For 15 Years by Louis Ulbach. Translated by Elizabeth Wormley Latimer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16. The Livre d'écrou is ended. Gaston was carried to his own chamber and laid upon his bed. He breathed with difficulty. He was neither red nor pale, but the blood had settled in his face and made it blue in places, with white blotches under his skin. A deep wound on his temple was bleeding on the pillow. Gabrielle's first thought was to bandage the wound herself, but she sent off at once for the doctor. Meanwhile, she tried every remedy she knew of to relieve apoplexy. For some minutes her sole thought was that there lay her husband, wounded and dying. Did she still love him, or was it that she pitied him? Or did she hope still, against hope, that she might bring his body back to life and awaken a new spiritual life in his soul? No, she thought of nothing but the pressing exigencies of the passing moment, doing, speaking, and ordering with clearness, sense, and energy. But all the time 2 rivers of tears flowed from her eyes. Gaston, though he did not come to himself, seemed rather more easy. His wife sat down beside the bed watching him. Then she first began to remember her son. Roger was standing in the doorway, not daring to enter. He had helped the servants to carry his father upstairs, and when they went away, he withdrew too. From afar, with eager eyes and a white face, he stood watching his parents, feeling like a parricide, dreading lest his victim should recover consciousness and curse him. That curse would have seemed to him both a just punishment for his unhappy rashness and a sort of comfort to his conscience, which reproached him
for not being able to feel like a son toward a dying father. Then, too, he dreaded his mother. Might she not be angry with him for not having confided in her? Indeed, for not having obeyed her. Gabrielle, by a little silent movement of her head, summoned him to come to her. He entered the room slowly, with his head bowed on his breast, and knelt down before her. "Oh, forgive me," he sighed with deep grief in his tone. Gabrielle suddenly remembered something that had struck her in the first shock of that fatal moment. "Was it you, then," she whispered,
"Who picked out of the ashes the thing I tried to find there?"
"I was very wrong, was I not? No, it was God's will. There had to be proofs. I, too, have kept the banknotes." "Oh," interrupted Roger in the same tone, his face flushed with the disgrace of being connected with a robbery as well as with a murder. There was a brief silence. "I have lived 15 years and known it," said Gabrielle, wishing to comfort him. "Dear saint," murmured Roger, kissing her hands. "But the trials of these years have been as nothing to what is coming," she resumed. "The great trial is beginning now." She turned her eyes toward Gaston on his pillow. Roger followed the direction of her glance and rose. They both stood looking at the guilty man, lying there struggling for breath. "I do not want him to see me when he first comes to himself," said Roger. "He bore the sight of me this morning, and yesterday," said Gabrielle in a sad voice. "What? Did he know that you knew?" "Yes, he confessed it all to me yesterday. We had an explanation." Dear martyr! Roger looked at her almost with adoration. He added, "Why did you never let me share your griefs before? Ah, my child, you have more than your share now. You need not covet mine." Then Roger remembered Florence. He thought his mother was alluding to her when she spoke of his sufferings. He gave a quick sigh. Youth always thinks that what deprives it of its hopes is unjust and cruel. But he regained his courage and met even the loss of Florence like a man and a hero. "I ask of God but one thing," said Gabrielle, "that he may recover, that God will give us back him whose soul we must save, whatever else may happen." Roger, by a slight movement of his lips, assented to this sentiment, the last proof of wifely love. But in spite of himself, it was rather in obedience to his mother's wish that he assented than from any real faith that his father would live to be a penitent man. After another silence, he asked hesitatingly, "Did the servants hear what passed?" "No," replied Gabrielle, "we were alone." "But suppose anyone told them?" "Ah, you don't know her as well as I do," replied Gabrielle. "She is incapable of meanness. If she strikes us, if she gives us up to justice, it will be openly, in broad daylight, not secretly, by no underhand means. But she may—" Her voice grew lower and lower. She was afraid that what she was about to say might betray a lack of courage. It had been the secret calculation of her life for 15 years, and now she was about to own it to her son, to confide her hope to him, in hopes to give him courage. Roger leaned over her to catch her words. "Perhaps," she murmured, "she may take pity on you both, my children." Roger drew himself up proudly. "Hush, mother. Never let us think of that again." He was renouncing the love to which his thoughts had turned only a minute before. The sick man moved slightly and gave a little sigh. Roger drew back into one corner of the room, afraid of being seen. Gaston opened his eyes with difficulty, but he saw nothing. They were bloodshot, the pupils were dilated, and he could not see. He struggled a few moments to regain possession of his memory, to recall what had taken place, and then with thick lips murmured, "That hammer, that hammer, my cane. Gabrielle has betrayed me." At this monstrous injustice, Roger was rushing forward to protest, to accuse himself, and to defend his mother. Gabrielle restrained him by a movement of her hand. Gaston lifted himself a little with great difficulty, raised his hand to his head, felt the bandages, followed them with his fingers till he discovered the wound, then suddenly recovering full possession of his senses, As if he had touched the spring of life, he said, with eyes that had regained their vision, "It is in the same place. It was there, just there. Oh, murderer, murderer!" Gabrielle and Roger trembled. They had not thought of the analogy which struck the dying man. It seemed as if a last gleam of intelligence had flitted across his brain to show him the inevitable justice, the eye for an eye, the stroke for a stroke, of that invisible hand which for 15 years he had counted on escaping. He tore at his wound to make it open. He felt no physical pain. His suffering was mental. He roused himself to complete consciousness. The mist disappeared from his eyes. He saw Roger standing beside his mother, and he called to him. "It was you, then, who made that drawing. Did you see it at the time? But that was enough. Why did you strike me?" At that moment the doctor came into the room. Gabrielle and Roger clung to each other as they stood by the bed. They now had a double terror. What might the doctor think? What might not Gaston say if he went on speaking? The doctor, as he felt the patient's pulse and listened to his breathing, and uncovered the wound upon his head, began to ask questions. "How did the accident happen?" "It was a fall," said Roger quickly. Something like a smile seemed to pass over the lips of Monsieur de Monterey. He breathed out faintly, "Yes, it was a fall." The doctor tried to bleed him, but the blood would not flow. The prick of the lancet seemed to extinguish the little life left in him. Was Gaston terrified at the sight of his own blood? He closed his eyes and opened them no more. The doctor shook his head. That shake was the signing of the death warrant. He put his lancet in his pocket, laid Gaston back upon his pillow, drew aside, and said in a low voice to Roger, "You had better send for the cure." Gabrielle heard him and fell upon her knees. Roger gave his father a long look of compassion, of farewell, and of repentance. Then he went out with the doctor. "Monsieur," said he, with anguish in his voice, when they were out of the sick chamber, "is there really no hope? Can nothing be done?" "Nothing. But 5 minutes ago he seemed rational and was talking." The old doctor was a good Catholic. "Then I regret," he said, "that you did not send at once for a priest. He might have been able to make his confession." Roger looked down. He had never thought about confession, quite the contrary. But now he dreaded it no longer. He called a servant and gave him orders to go as fast as possible to the cure's house and bring the cure. Then, as the servants all pressed round him full of sympathy to ask after their master, he added, "You may say that he is dying." These words he uttered in a loud, sharp voice, as if he hoped that Florence and Madame Emilienne would hear them in their part of the building. That done, he went back to his father's chamber. He went up to the bed and took his hand. He wanted to feel its last vital warmth. He wanted to warm it by the pressure of his own. The death struggle began, but it was brief, and when a quarter of an hour after, the cure came in, out of breath, the hand of Gaston was quite cold, and a mask of yellowish wax seemed to have overspread his face of marble. The cure, who had come to absolve him, had no hesitation in pronouncing a conditional absolution over the great man of the village, whose wife was so charitable a lady, and he went off to have all his bells tolled, as an announcement to the surrounding country that there was going to be a splendid funeral before long in his parish. Gabrielle's grief and that of Roger were equally great, but they were different. Both were overwhelmed by the suddenness of what had happened, and death, which took from them the guilty soul they had trusted they might yet bring to repentance, gave them back in his stead, in the depths of their remembrance, the husband and father. They would not reproach each other, nor could they feel remorse. A sense of justice, stronger than mere feeling, told them that they had been but the blind instruments of a divine law, not its interpreters. The trial was ended. A solemn peace seemed now to rest upon the memory of the guilty man they mourned for. They might now forget everything, except that the wife might remember how truly she had once loved him, and the son that he had for years been a respectful and dutiful son. They wept together simply and copiously, and though they did not acknowledge it to themselves, it seemed to them as if their tears were a propitiatory offering, which heaven might accept on his behalf, even after he was gone. For 15 years, all Gabrielle's thoughts had been divided, as it were, into two portions. Half of each thought had been always on the alert, watching over her terrible secret and its scandals. After about an hour, Madame de Monterey said to her son, turning toward a window that looked out on the detached building occupied by Madame Emilienne, "She ought to know it." "I will go," replied Roger, with the steady courage of a soldier. "No," replied his mother, "not you. It would be an unnecessary humiliation on your part, or it might excite her dangerously. Let us leave her free to act as she thinks proper." Roger rang the bell. Gabrielle ordered a servant to let Madame Emilienne know the misfortune that had come upon them. "Madame Emilienne is gone," replied the servant. Why did he say gone instead of gone out, which would have been more natural? "How long since?" "She went away this morning, a little while after the accident." Mother and son exchanged an anxious glance. "Let me know when the ladies come back," said Madame de Monterey. The servant left the room. "They will never come back," said Roger piteously. "They will bring the police," sighed Gabrielle. "What would be the use of that now?" "They can, at least, ruin our family honor." "Ah, they may have all mine," cried Roger, wringing his hands. "But what will you do?" "I provided for everything long ago. I have thought of that, like all the rest. She is right. She could not have remained here. For 15 years she has been prepared to leave at any moment, and I have been prepared, too, for flight any day. We will go away now, will we not, dear mother?" "Yes, we will sell the chateau. But it need not now be a flight. We have nothing more to fear for him." Roger and his mother stayed all day and all night in the chamber of the dead, like soldiers at their post, never losing sight of Gaston's corpse, moved partly by pity, partly by dread. As the hours went by, the fear became less, the grief became more. Yet at the least noise outside, Gabrielle started and fancied she was about to see the police enter the room, solemnly ushered in by Emilienne. Of course, they could now do nothing against Gaston, but might they not question her, and force Roger to acknowledge that it was with that hammer-like cane his father had murdered Pierre Mortier? She felt it was her duty to satisfy the legitimate demands of the widow. The crime, so long hidden, would be raked up, now that her husband was dead. No honors would be paid him even at his funeral, and as his coffin passed to its last resting place, all those who looked on would view it with contempt and horror. But that day, that night, and the next day passed, and no one came to the Chateau de l'Hupois but those whose business it was to provide for the honors to be paid to the dead. Up to the hour of the funeral, no breath of scandal had sullied the memory of Monsieur de Monterey. Gabrielle wanted to watch over her husband and to protect him to the last. She had vague fears of some possible insult to his body in the church or at the graveyard, and leaning on the arm of her son, she insisted on following the bier on which the man so dear to her once, so guilty before the law, was escaping earthly punishment. When she took the place of chief mourner in the funeral procession heading the servants from the chateau and the workpeople from the slate quarry, she suddenly found herself in the presence of Madame Emilienne, who, in deep mourning, but with a gravity of bearing that might have been mistaken for profound respect, was in her place in the procession. Gabrielle looked for Florence. Florence would have seemed a pledge of pardon, but Florence was not there. The two widows gazed a moment at each other. There was no threatening look in their sad eyes. They were like two men upon the ground to fight a duel, who would think it dishonorable to add any further provocation to that which they have met to settle by the sword. Roger, too, noticed Emilienne. A faint color rose in his face. He did not need to look for Florence. He knew she could not be there, for his heart would have told him of her presence. The ceremony had all the solemnity due to Monsieur de Monterey's fortune and position, so far as it could be furnished by the church in a country village. The curiosity of all the neighborhood was satisfied. Big silver tears were sewed all over the black draperies, but the only real tears seen by Roger and Gabrielle were in the eyes of each other. If they did not see any in Madame Emilienne's eyes, it was because they did not think of looking for them there. With her face in her hands, she was weeping bitterly. Was it that this funeral was burying her chance of vengeance? No, she wept for that other dear corpse that she had not been permitted to have buried, that she had not even seen, huddled into its grave in haste by turnkeys and underlings of the prison. She wept for him for whom for 15 years she had dreamed of providing a noble funeral. The reader must not forget that Madame Jean Mortier had been once a pious woman. She needed all that still remained to her of religion not to rise up and angrily accuse the injustice, not to say the ingratitude, of heaven, which refused her this reparation so long ardently wished for. It seemed to her that she was losing Jean Mortier over again, and losing him now forever, that not till now had the dishonor of her husband been complete. What? Must the murderer triumph? Here was his corpse, being followed with esteem by all his neighbors in his funeral procession. There was his widow weeping, pitied, admired, envied, for people do envy even the sorrows of the rich, while she, the widow of the righteous man, the man who had been sacrificed, tortured into his grave, was taking part as a hypocrite in this false show of grief and honor. Of course, all this splendid funeral could be made to seem a falsehood. Of course, it was in her power to take an overwhelming revenge. The work that now lay before her was no longer a work of reparation, but of vengeance. And with her ideas all confusion and her feelings made more acute by witnessing the grief of others, she actually prayed to God to give her free scope to avenge herself, though she well knew that God would reserve to himself the right of pardon and of pity. When all was over, and when Madame de Monterey had returned to the chateau, Emilienne asked to see her. Gabrielle was prepared for this interview. Roger, who was in the salon with his mother, asked leave to remain, but Jean Mortier's widow, after a suitable greeting, stood so rigid, so straight, so determined not to say one word while he was present, that Gabrielle said to him, "You had better leave us." And Roger could not disobey her. He was tempted to listen at the door, but he felt ashamed of such a piece of treachery. His mother, he knew, had courage, more courage than he. Emilienne was alone. She was the mother of Florence. He might fear her, but he could not hate her, and he dreaded to commit the meanness of slandering her husband's widow. He had to leave the field to the two rivals in grief. He had to accept whatever punishment the widow of Jean Mortier brought with her. He went into the white parlor and sat down before the table on which he had made that fatal drawing. There he hid his face in his hands and wept, but they were softer tears than those he had wept that morning or the night before. He remembered only that Florence was lost, and what good would his life do him? End of chapter 16.
Chapter 17 of For 15 Years by Louis Ulbach. Translated by Elizabeth Wormley Latimer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17. Accounts are settled. Alone, in presence of each other, Emilienne and Gabrielle, who had led for 15 years a life in common, seemed embarrassed by their tete-a-tete. Both at the same moment remembered the visit that Jean Mortier's wife had made to the wife of Monsieur de Monterey to get some information from her the day after the arrest of the innocent upholsterer. The 15 years since of mutual strategy seemed now like a long dream. They had gone back, as it were, to the day after the murder. Only this time it was Emilienne who had the upper hand, It was she who could now say, "The hammer is the proof. Your husband was the murderer." Alas, what use could she now make of her advantage? Gabrielle was standing. If she sat down, she was afraid it might seem as if she were feeling her own weakness. But yet, in receiving Emilienne, she did not like to appear to expect that their interview would be a brief one. She waved her hand vaguely, therefore, toward a chair. Madame Mortier observed the gesture. She walked up to a chair and leaned upon it, remaining standing. Gabrielle leaned against a cabinet. They were different in features and expression as they stood there, but alike lovely and alike in sorrow. They were rivals in grief and in their dignity as widows. It would have been hard to say at first sight which of the two had been a widow for 2 days and which for 15 years, which was in her own house and which had come to visit her. Emilienne displayed neither enmity nor compassion. She had dried her tears on leaving the church door. Secure as to her right and sure of her own power, she made use of both without desiring to add or to diminish aught from the part she had to play. "Excuse me, madame," she said, with a manner that implied that she needed no excuse, "but I thought we had better finish settling today the accounts between us." Gabrielle tried to hide a slight shudder that passed over her face. "I am at your service, madame," she replied simply. Emilienne continued, "I did not expect so suddenly to leave you, but fortunately, ever since you put me in a position of confidence, I have endeavored to be always prepared to give up my place to some other person. My books are all in order, and Gabrielle could not repress her astonishment. "Was that what you came for?" she cried. "Of course." Madame de Monterey looked fixedly at Emilienne to disconcert her if she were simply ironical. She was willing to receive her blows, but not her scratches. The dark eyes of the other widow were inscrutable. "There is no hurry," said Gabrielle. "Pardon me, madame, there is hurry. On the contrary, I do not wish to remain any longer in this neighborhood, nor to re-enter this chateau." Madame de Monterey bowed her head, but she did not seem to flinch. Then she looked up. She was a brave woman. She thought of Roger, she felt herself strong for his sake, and since Madame Mortier seemed in no haste to attack her, threaten her, or strike her, she thought it better to bring on the attack, the threat, and the blow. "I hope you understand, madame," she said, with a gentleness which in itself was bravery, "that I am at your service for that, as I have been for the rest." She emphasized the important words. Madame Jean Mortier was obliged to take some notice of this speech. She dropped the lids over her dark eyes. "The rest," she said hoarsely, "is not so pressing now." "It would be but just, however," resumed Gabrielle, "not to say generous, not to keep us waiting for your decision." Emilienne's fierceness rekindled at these words. "And why," she said, "should I be generous?" "I said you should be just. You cannot be as bitter against my son as against me. I ask you to put an end to this suspense for the sake of my son." "And suppose I have not yet made up my mind," answered the widow with energy, "to anything more than that I will separate myself as entirely from this house as I always ought to have done? What I owe to Jean's memory shall be done, but I will do it as he would have done it himself if he had come back to me this day from the galleys, to which he was sent by your husband. He will judge of my justice from where he sits in heaven. I wish for no reparation which depends on money, neither must it be one of mere revenge. There must be some way upon earth to obtain what I mean. I will seek it out. I will take advice. But first of all, I wish to be quit of this hospitality that you forced upon me, which I have accepted for 15 years, and which hampers me. I know that I have paid for it, but it was much more advantageous to Florence than our life of poverty in our poor home would have been. While taking precautions to secure yourself, you have helped me as to my child. I remember all that, though I will not sacrifice to it more than I ought. You see, the pros and cons of this account are harder to adjust than the books of your slate quarry. You owe me nothing, said Gabrielle with respect to Florence. I always have loved her. I love her as a daughter still. Yes, your love for her was a snare in which you thought to entrap me. You are caught in your own trap. Well, it was my trap too. We may as well both own it. We have been both guilty on that point, and I more than you. But Florence loves her father's memory, and she will get over it. I will console her. Alas, said the other mother, I shall not be able to console Roger. Emilienne gave a little start of impatience, either to hinder Gabrielle from saying more upon that point, or to put aside any temptation to be merciful. Gabrielle went on, lowering her voice almost to a whisper. I am so afraid of his despair. If he should kill himself. Oh, in your family, men do not kill themselves, replied Madame Jean Mortier with cruel irony. Gabrielle looked at her gently. Do you hope to put Roger to the proof? She said. What use would the death of one who is innocent be to me? Said Madame Mortier. Do you suppose I hate Roger? If you ever have loved him, you might love him still. If I did love him, I should suffer to see him suffer, but I should go no further. I cannot mitigate his trial. Our sorrows fall hard upon our children, but it was you who brought it about. I hope the contrary. Since you were out of Paris, out of France, when you became afraid suspicion might fall upon your husband, why did you come back after you heard I was a widow? Oh, yes, I know that you are charitable, and that you thought you could appease your conscience by benevolence, and besides, it was a wise precaution. And yet nobody but me ever dreamed of Monsieur de Monterey. I always suspected him in secret, but nothing more. I knew that you suspected him. If you knew it, you ought to have let me struggle on in my poverty without bringing me here. Yet here, in the end, the truth has come out when you least expected it. I have always expected it, at any time. Did you know that your son could produce the proof? I did not know that Roger had kept the handle of a cane that his father had flung into the fire, but I have another proof myself, which I have always kept in reserve, not to prevent your knowing the truth when the time came to bring it to light, but to enable you to prove your husband's innocence more easily. Another proof? Cried Emilienne with an incredulous smile. A proof entirely conclusive, said Madame de Monterey calmly. What is it? Some banknotes stolen from Pierre Mortier, one of which has one of the numbers written down by the notary. You have one of those notes, you say? Yes. And you never burned it? No. And you own to me? I will give it to you. Emilienne made a gesture of amazement. She looked distrustfully at Gabrielle. Could she be mad? Or was she crushing her to the earth by her own greatness of soul? Will you really give me this proof? She said again presently. Certainly I will. Then I cannot understand, on your part, these 15 years of dissimulation. Madame Mortier stopped, as if she expected Gabrielle to make some explanation. But Gabrielle, who had now resumed her natural position of superiority, and who wished to keep it throughout the remainder of the interview, judged it unwise and useless to the only strong interest left her upon earth, the honor of Roger, to give any further explanation. She replied calmly, You have now, madame, everything necessary to restore the good name of your husband. It is your duty to do so, a duty that I envy you. We are going to leave this chateau and to sell it. It would be as painful to us to inhabit it as it is odious to you. I shall quit it, however, with regret. It has been the scene of many sufferings, but you will always know where to find us. We shall not attempt to evade a responsibility I have always foreseen. You will never hear of us again unless it be to respond to your questions by our depositions. Roger knows that he has forever said farewell to Florence. His despair must look to me for its cure. I shall always feel deep remorse on this subject, but you will never hear of it. And now, madame, since you seem to think it necessary I should look over your accounts, I am ready." Gabrielle could not smile on such a day, but the light in her eyes had all the sweetness and the piety of the smile of a Christian martyr. Emilienne, looking down, felt her dark eyes unable to meet those of the other widow, and in a tone like that submissive one in which, for 15 years, she had responded to all orders from Madame de Monterey, she asked permission to go and get her ledgers and accounts and left the room. During her absence, Gabrielle did not stir. She dreaded lest she might impair her courage by any change of attitude. She stood looking fixedly at the door which communicated with the vestibule of the white parlor. She was breathing a blessing from afar by magnetic projection, as it were, from her own heart, on the son for whose happiness, though all seemed lost, she struggled still. Emilienne returned with a great book under her arm. Gabrielle, as if it were but right to resume the old habits of the house, took her upstairs to her own little sitting room on the first story, where she had always been in the habit of settling their accounts and talking over the affairs of the chateau. She took her usual place. Emilienne placed herself at the corner of the little writing table, and the accounts were gone over by them both, while not even a tone of voice in the words that they exchanged together betokened that any other matters were pressing on their minds. In this settlement of accounts, there was one indispensable part that was especially delicate. Gabrielle had to give Madame Emilienne her salary and her share of the profits of the quarry, according to an agreement between them. Jean Mortier's widow did not, however, humiliate Madame de Monterey by declining this money. She thought it quite proper that an agreement should be carried out. She was not ashamed of making money. She was neither proud of it nor indifferent to it. The last column was added up. The last signature was made. Gabrielle rose and laid down her pen. Madame Emilienne let some papers she was holding in her hand, vouchers for the settlement of the accounts, drop on the table. The hands of the two women almost met for 1 second, then each drew back her own. All was finished, but it almost seemed as if neither could bear to end the interview. At last, Emilienne rose slowly and went silently toward the door. Then she turned round quickly, for she heard a slight noise made by Gabrielle in opening the little cabinet where she kept her private papers. A flash darted from Emilienne's eyes, and she glanced eagerly into the recesses of this mysterious cabinet, which she had looked at so often and with such ardent curiosity. Gabrielle saw the look. She went on searching till she had found a sealed envelope, which she held out to Emilienne. "Take it, madame," she said unflinchingly. "It is a letter which would have been sent to you after I was dead, had I died first. It will give you permission to receive from my notary another envelope in which are banknotes stolen from Pierre Mortier, which will make manifest the innocence of your husband and the guilt of mine." Emilienne hesitated to take the envelope. "Take it, I beg of you," said Gabrielle. Emilienne obeyed her. Madame de Monterey then took from the same shelf 3 manuscript books, which she also offered to the upholsterer's widow. "I ask but one kindness from you, madame," she said gently. "It is to take these books with you and to read them." "No," replied Emilienne, drawing back. "Do not refuse me. Do not be so unkind." "The unkindness consists, it seems to me, in thinking me capable of wishing to pry into your secret thoughts. If you have now, or have ever had that curiosity, I should consider it perfectly allowable, and the most scrupulous conscience need not be ashamed of it. On certain subjects we have never talked together. We have never exchanged confidences. A few minutes ago, you said something which showed me that you do not understand my conduct for the past 15 years. These books may help you to understand it. Do not be afraid. They contain neither my defense nor my excuses. I should not fear the effect on me of any defense or any excuses, replied Emilienne, in a tone of bitterness, defiance, and condescension. Gabrielle went on gently. Every day I have written in these books all I have done, and I have given the reasons for my doing it. You will find here how cowardly I have often been. It is my confession. God does not need it, for he knows it all, but I thought it useful to myself. It has helped me to bear the burden of my life. It witnesses without reserve against me and against him whose widow's weeds I wear. You owe it to your husband's memory and to him who is the judge of all to read these manuscripts. That done, our accounts will be settled. There will be nothing more to be added to them. All will be cleared up at last. Your task will be much simplified. I think you will be able to see then, better than you see now, how to do justice to the memory of a man who was innocent, without taking from the heirs of him who was guilty the credit of making a voluntary expiation. That expiation Roger is now about to commence. I began it 15 years ago. Emilienne trembled. A flush rose to her face. I do not need to be told, she said, that you have suffered. Then she added, to soften the seeming harshness of this reply, I can at least give you my esteem. Then you will read what I have written without prejudice? That is all I ask. What is the use? Nothing can ever alter our relative positions. Nothing, of course. But when we have each done our duty to the utmost, our whole duty, we shall have more courage to console our children. Your daughter will be strengthened by the knowledge that you are not unjust. My son, by the testimony of my conscience, that I was never in heart the accomplice of the crime of which I was in part the cause. My duty is ended. I have but to wait patiently for the fulfillment of yours. Madame Mortier, under the influence of Gabrielle's simple dignity, felt that she was losing ground. Her wrongs did not seem to give her an absolute advantage in this solemn interview over Madame de Monterey's dignity, education, and skill in the use of language. Each roughness or rudeness on her part seemed to her to compromise her cause. She was embarrassed in accepting what she had so long hoped for. Well then, madame, she said, taking the written books, I promise you to read them. The two women left the little parlor together and went downstairs in silence, step by step and side by side. Do you wish to speak to Roger? Asked Madame de Monterey. No, but there must be some newspapers and papers in that room, which my daughter took from me in order that your son might read them. I shall want them. You have a right to them. Gabrielle was about to open the door of the white parlor. Emilienne feared she had been rough and cruel. She stopped her by a movement of her hand and said, It will do if you forward them to me with my things, which I will send for tomorrow. No, replied Gabrielle decidedly. It is better that no one here should have a chance to look at them, if it has not been done already. She opened the door. Roger, who was sitting at a table with his face on his arms, raised his head. My boy, said Madame de Monterey, what did you do with the papers Florence lent you? Roger grew paler than before. I don't know, he stammered. Gabrielle glanced round the room. On a table in one corner of the parlor, a servant, in setting things to right, had put in one pile all the papers she had picked up on the floor, where Roger 2 days before had scattered them. Are not those the papers? Asked Madame de Monterey, touching them, as they say King Charles I touched the axe of his executioner. Those are the papers, replied Emilienne. Gabrielle walked away, leaving the upholsterer's widow to gather together the documents relating to the trial. When she had them all under her arm, Emilienne bowed her head and went out, by one of the glass doors, into the garden. Mother and son looked at each other. Roger's eyes asked anxiously what had passed, but he did not say a word. "Oh, my son, promise me," his mother cried, "that whatever happens, you will live and bear the life before you." "Why do you require that promise?" replied Roger. "Because I must live and bear life, too, my boy," replied his mother. These words burst forth from her, dictated in part by faith and partly by despair. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of For 15 Years by Louis Ulbach. Translated by Elizabeth Warmley Latimer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 18. The Pursuit. A fortnight, 15 days passed by. Madame Jean Mortier, the day after her visit to the chateau, sent a messenger to bring her everything she had left in her apartments, and no one dared to ask him any questions about her. Where was she? Gabrielle thought it probable she had gone to Paris. In Paris she could find the best lawyers, and they would advise her as to what had better be done. Madame de Monterey awaited, with patient anxiety, the result of her deliberations. The estate of Houpois, its chateau and its slate quarry were put up for sale. Roger had been feverishly active in taking the necessary steps to dispose of the property. He had been several times to Fumay, and had made a journey to Rocroi. A vague hope, which he was hardly conscious of himself, kept up his courage as he went round the country. Might he not come suddenly, by chance, upon some trace of Florence and her mother? Of course, he formed no wishes, he indulged no hopes. He had promised his mother to bear the burden of his broken life, but he had not promised her to wish to live. He knew that all self-deception was impossible. He knew that Florence's proud sense of dignity would be equal to his own. When she had promised him to be his wife, if he discovered the truth, she could never have imagined that the truth that would remove the stain upon her name would destroy the happiness of both, would part them, and, alas, make them love each other more. He knew that she, like himself, must be crushed beneath the blow. But though she might suffer as much as he, neither she nor he had any right to feel remorse for what they had done. She had simply done her duty in trying to find out the man who was really guilty. He had done his in obeying her, and in not being daunted by any obstacle, not even though he sacrificed the honor of his father. He knew that she, as well as himself, would try to take submissively the blow which ruined their young lives, and which they had themselves brought down upon each other. Only Roger wanted to see Florence for one last interview, to bid her that farewell forever which he dreamed he would have courage to speak. He fancied sometimes that his misfortunes were not great enough, that the pang of a last glance together at their lost happiness would test his courage. If they could but have that, all the rest would seem to them a matter of course. They would yield without a murmur to their destiny. Could I only see her again! Ah, but once more, he cried. He confided this mad longing to his mother. Gabrielle and Roger had no secrets from each other. The flash of lightning, which had laid bare their hearts, had drawn them closer together. Their love became something more than filial on the part of the son who had sat in judgment upon his other parent, more than maternal on the mother's part, whose aim in life was now to heal the wound that love had left when hope was rent away. When all pretexts for scouring the neighborhood were over, when a day was set for the sale of the property, when great placards were posted up in all the adjoining villages and on the gate-posts at the entrance of the chateau, Roger's state of depression greatly alarmed Madame de Monterey. She felt that she had less strength to struggle against discouragement in the house where her first long trial had ended so disastrously. She wanted to hasten their departure. She almost regretted that she had not yet received the first hostile demonstration on the part of the widow of Jean Mortier. When would she begin the work of avenging her husband's memory? Roger's courage needed a stimulant. A manager who had been engaged to take Madame Emilienne's place was to answer all inquiries on the part of possible purchasers of the slate quarry. He would manage the affairs there and look after the chateau till it should be sold. Gabrielle, when the day of their departure was fixed, wished to leave Houpois alone with her son. If they should give way to grief upon the journey, no curious servant need be by to speculate upon their tears. On reaching Paris, they would go into furnished lodgings. But would they stay long in Paris? Why should they not go at once to Italy? Madame de Monterey had almost made up her mind to consult some magistrate or lawyer, that she might know exactly how far she was liable and what risks she would run. She wished fully and voluntarily to pay all that was honorably due to the widow of the man who had suffered being innocent. But that being ascertained and settled, she wished to be free to devote herself to Roger's cure, if he were curable, or to share the contagion of his grief and die of a broken heart with him, if his case were beyond a cure. If they should decide on any fixed residence, either in Paris or elsewhere, their servants and their furniture could come after them. After a long visit to the church, the graveyard, and the village poor, Gabrielle, one evening at dusk, got into her landau with her son to drive over to Fumay, where the same night they would take the train for Paris. Alone, hand in hand, very pale and in deep mourning, with their heads bent toward each other, not weeping because each feared to make the other weep, but with their hearts full of an immeasurable grief, through which shot poignantly the thought that they were quitting the home where Roger had dreamed his love dreams, and his mother had suffered and prayed, saying farewell as they drove to every spot they knew. And every turn of the road they passed, they went on rapidly. The movement of the carriage seemed to lull them in their misery. When they had driven about two-thirds of the way and began to perceive the lights of Fumay, the road being very dark, they came near running into a carriage which was coming in an opposite direction and carried no lighted lanterns. Madame de Monterey's coachman pulled up his horses and did not miss the opportunity of abusing the driver of the offending four-wheeled cabriolet, accusing him of going to sleep on his box. A sharp, croaking voice responded by an oath. Then the shabby vehicle turned out of the road to make way for the aristocratic carriage with its shining lamps. The landau went on. The man of the foul tongue, who possibly did not think he had sworn enough, or who may have considered that he had been abused more than sufficiently, seemed anxious to exchange more sharp words with the other coachman. He screamed after him. But if Madame de Monterey's coachman could not refrain from gratifying his natural instincts by abuse of the awkward driver, who might have injured his horses or locked his wheels, he was too well behaved to stop and quarrel, especially when he was driving the family. He whipped up his horses and put them into so fast a trot that it soon became a gallop. When they had galloped about 250 yards, Roger, astonished at the pace that they were going, put his head out of the carriage and told the man to drive more slowly. "I don't want that old rattletrap to catch up with me," answered the coachman contemptuously. Roger looked back on hearing this, and saw, sure enough, that the dilapidated cabriolet, which had now got its lamps lighted, was trying to come up with them. Its lamps seemed blinking and flashing like two great fierce and angry eyes. They could hear the driver's whip crack and his voice shout, and many oaths and curses. "All right," said Roger to his coachman. "Go on at any pace you like, only take care the horses do not run away with you." Being authorized to keep up his gallop, the coachman brought down his horses to a trot. It was not disobedience, it was simply a love of contradiction. He thought he would not tire his beasts, and he did not like to seem afraid. The trot, however, of such horses as his, more than equaled the lumbering gallop of a common cart horse. "It seems as if we were running away," murmured Gabrielle in a tone of sarcasm. Roger made no remark. Madame de Monterey resumed. "Perhaps that carriage was going to the chateau." "Not likely," said Roger. Gabrielle looked out the window on her side. "What a pursuit," she said dreamily. "Gendarmes seldom make such efforts to come up with evildoers." Gendarmes don't go about in carriages, said Roger with an effort to make fun of the remark, which, however, made him uncomfortable. Not when they are alone, but suppose they have a magistrate with them. What a notion that is of yours, dear mamma. Gabrielle shook her head. I am sure, she said, that they are in chase of us. Roger, out of consideration for his mother, looked out again. The two lamps were keeping behind them at about the same distance, jerking up and down, but steadily coming after them. They are following us, he said. You mean pursuing us. Let us wait for their carriage. In 3 minutes more we shall be in Fumay, and then, if you like, we can stop. Yes, I do wish to. I am afraid of seeming cowardly. Don't be afraid of anything, dear mother. You will see that this is nothing but a country boor angry at what Baptiste said to him. It is a quarrel between drivers, that is all. We shall soon know. The man would be mad to drive after us like that for such a little cause. We are not sure that he is alone. Roger did not contradict his mother this time. He began to be possessed of a strange disquietude. In 3 minutes the landau reached the outskirts of Fumay and stopped at the entrance of the town, at a nice little inn which had been transformed into a poor hotel, the Soleil d'Or, where travelers, either on foot or horseback, could find entertainment. Madame de Monterey was in the habit of baiting her horses at this place whenever she drove into the town. The landlord's wife, who looked out when she heard the wheels of the carriage, came up to the door of the landau, opened it, and called the stable boy to take the horses. No matter, said Madame de Monterey languidly. We are going on to the station. The station at Fumay is a quarter of a mile beyond the town. Oh, you have plenty of time, madame, replied the woman. You have a good half-hour before the train starts. Gabrielle had got down from her landau. Roger got out too, and while his mother walked into the inn, he stationed himself in the middle of the street, ready to punish the impertinence of the driver of the cabriolet, who came along as fast as his wheels would fly over the stones, or to receive the first shock of anything that might be dreadful for his mother. The cabriolet, with its rusty wheels jangling and clattering, came jerking over the pavement, the driver whipping his horse all the way. He pulled up right behind the landau. It was not the driver who got down. He drew back to give place to a black shadow that slipped past him and went quickly toward the door of the inn. But Roger stepped between the shadow and the door. Is it you, madame? He said. He recognized Emilienne. Where is your mother? She asked abruptly. Roger pointed to the inn, but at the same time he made a movement to prevent Madame Mortier from entering. Come with me, she said, grasping his arm and drawing him after her. Gabrielle had been shown into a little room reserved for travelers of distinction, a room very rarely put in requisition. The landlady was lighting 2 wax candles on the mantelpiece. Madame de Monterey had heard the wheels of the other carriage and knew that it had stopped. She put one hand over her heart. Her heart had beat too quickly for some time. Emilienne pushed open the door that stood ajar and went forward. Roger could no longer hold her back. The face of Madame Jean Mortier gleamed with a strange new brightness. She felt sure of her triumph, for she said as she came in, You knew it was me then, madame? You drove so fast. I did not know it. I am so glad I have come up with you. The 2 women looked a moment at each other. A round table covered with a cloth stood between them. They waited till the hostess had adjusted her 2 plated candlesticks on the fireplace, one on each side of a wooden clock, and had then retired. As soon as she had closed the door, Gabrielle said ceremoniously, I would have waited for you at the chateau, madame, if you had let me know. It would have taken too long, and then I have but just decided. What do you want of us? Said Gabrielle faintly. She drew up a chair and sat down, partly with a sense of what was due to her own dignity, partly because she trembled so that she dared not try to stand. Emilienne leaned, both hands closed upon the table, also in order to steady herself, and to prevent the trembling of her hands. I want to give you back, madame, she said, the journals you did me the honor to lend me. Gabrielle looked at her son with some anxiety in her eyes. Was Emilienne going, before him, to desecrate this sacred confession so frankly confided to her? Was she going to make use of her own words to put her to fresh torture? You might have sent them back to me, or burned them, or kept them, she said slowly. No, madame. I was very anxious to bring them myself, and to tell you what I think of them. As she raised her voice with an unnatural ring in it, Gabrielle's fear grew greater. Roger, leave us, she said to her son. No, Roger, stay, said Emilienne with authority. I want you. There was no threat apparent in her words, but this made her only the more formidable. Was she so very sure of the effect of the blow she was about to strike that she wanted a spectator? She walked round the table that divided her from Gabrielle, and when she was quite close to Madame de Monterey, she hesitated as to what she was about to say. Then suddenly she bowed her head, bent down almost on her knees, and said in a voice whose very humility and tenderness seemed harsh and strained, "Will you ever forgive me for having so long tried to struggle against the respect, the admiration, the love I feel for you?" Gabrielle, in her amazement, uttered a little cry. She came near fainting. This sudden, violent, unexpected proceeding was too much for her in the state of her heart. Roger, breathless, ready to do anything to protect or to support his mother, came to her side. His eyes were full of fear. He could not understand anything. Yes, pursued Emilienne, now kneeling altogether before Madame de Monterey, and taking her hands, which she lifted to her lips. Forgive me. I have tried to hate you, but I never could. I have tried to have no pity for your sorrows, and I was forced to pity you. I tried to avenge my wrongs, and I have been miserable. You are much better than I, for you have suffered more than I, and yet your life has been a life of love. Ah, Roger, what a mother you have!" Here Emilienne's voice failed her. She gave a long sob, though she shed no tears. Gabrielle, leaning over her, tried to protest and endeavored to raise her. "No, no, leave me where I am. I ought long ago to have knelt at your feet. I was proud of my power to torture you because Jean had been an innocent victim. I have measured your sorrow now with mine, and I find that it was far greater. How well it was you made me read those journals. Only an angel could have written them. Those pages, where I found so many traces of your tears, seemed as if celestial wings had fanned them. Oh, Roger, Roger, if you only knew! But you shall read them too." "No, no," cried Gabrielle, confused, bewildered, and overjoyed. "Why not? Our children have already been made to sit in judgment on us. Why should anything be withheld from them? It is my turn now. Florence gave you those odious, dreadful papers to read, Roger, did she not? She is keeping your mother's journals, which she has read and reread, for you. Go and read them with her." "Florence? Oh, where is she?" "Here, in this inn. We have never gone farther." "Here?" Roger hesitated. He looked at his mother. He looked at Emilienne. "Let him go, madame," she said. "Let him go and find Florence. You can leave us alone now, Roger." She smiled as she said this, but there were tears in her eyes. Roger pressed a kiss upon his mother's forehead and quickly left the room. Emilienne, who would not rise from her knees, for she felt gratification in thus being able to assume an attitude of adoration to the woman whose grace and virtue had, in her hours of hate, so often tempted her to love and to admire her, now said more gravely, but with the same eagerness, "Let us hasten, madame, before the children come back, to make an end of all sad things. I told you I would do what my husband would have done had he returned home from the galleys. He would not have disinterred the dead, nor dragged him forth for public degradation. 2 weeks ago, I sprinkled holy water over him who did us both such terrible wrong. I will not falsify the sign of the cross I then made over him. He has paid his 15 years of penalty, and you have likewise paid them. If you do not curse his memory, I will not pain you by my bitterness. I need not ask advice from a lawyer. I have asked it from my Jean. He blames me for being unmerciful toward the merciful. Anything I could do would not bring him back to life again. See, I will prove to you that I am no longer proud of what I call my rights. I ask you to make the arrangement you dared not propose to me. Your husband was the cause of the dishonor of our name. Well, give me his name for my daughter. I know you have wished for this marriage. The wish is on every page of your journal. It is my wish too. Alas! This was the punishment you had hoped to inflict on the pride of Monsieur de Monterey. I will live happy under my still dishonored name, for I shall know now that my child is happy. You are a better Christian than I. I have been jealous of you. If you only knew how my heart loved you all the time that I was trying with all my strength not to let you perceive it. Every time I threatened you, or wished to threaten you, I had to overcome the temptation to cry aloud and tell you that I loved you. Ah, I could not but suspect what were your secret sorrows. Yes, I have often wanted to look into your journals. I've been tempted to steal them. You guessed that, perhaps, and you have done well to lend them to me. They have made my heart purer. They have filled it with a new light. They have taught me true justice. They have revealed to me true goodness. What more can I tell you? I love you, I love you. I will never leave you unless you send me away. Emilienne could hardly breathe. Her passionate nature, so long restrained by a feeling she thought stronger than the attraction exercised over her by Gabrielle, having burst all barriers in its swift overflow, now knew no restraint. Two great tears gathered in her eyes, but she wiped them away quickly. To weep was to lose time, and she had so much lost time to redeem. Ah, how you frightened me, murmured Gabrielle, who hardly knew what she was saying. Just now, you mean, when I pursued you? I knew that placards of the sale were all over the country. I guessed you would soon leave the chateau. I said at first that I would write to you in Paris, that I would go to Paris and seek you there. But today I grew too impatient to wait. I comprised matters to save myself from shame. I fancied, if I got to the chateau after dark, that the familiar places would not recognize me, and that I should not see them. I thought that you would be alone, your presence the only thing luminous in all the darkness. The awkwardness of my driver caused me to recognize your carriage. How we drove! Did you know that I had bought your horses? I was sorry for it this evening." As Gabrielle listened to Madame Jean Mortier, who in her almost delirious eagerness was now making this allusion to the horses, she had been at first almost beside herself with surprise. But this touch of gaiety in Madame Emilienne seemed to bring her back to her senses again. "You are sure," she said with a slight smile, "that you will never regret what you have now said to me?" "Never. I am very sure." "I am so used to fear," said Gabrielle, "that I hardly know how to hope. You have so entirely fulfilled my dearest wishes by flinging yourself voluntarily into what you were once pleased to call my snare, that I dread being awakened from a dream so sweet to me." "Ah, madame," replied Emilienne, who in presence of this gentle seriousness became serious and devout, "God alone can know if we shall always remain reasonable. There may come back to me moments of bitterness, wafts of feeling from the days that are past, and the same thing may happen to you. Jean was innocent of murder, but he committed the crime of suicide. I have never felt that until now. I was thinking too much of avenging him. We have each to pray for a husband who has been guilty. That will unite us before the altar, and that is the best cement of a true friendship. We shall each keep our own sorrows. The happiness of our children will shine on a dark background." Gabrielle's triumph overcame her. She forced Emilienne to sit down by her side, put both arms round her neck, and drew her closely to her bosom. It was the first time they had ever had any real communion during the 15 years that they had lived together. The past was stifled in that close embrace. The door opened. Florence and Roger entered. They were both pale, but a faint light glimmered through their sadness. They held each other by the hand. They went up to their mothers, looked at them with faith and love, and their smiles were smiles of thanks and benediction. The light of the guttering candles flung back shadows over a group of four beautiful heads. Madame de Monterey's coachman sent up word that he was afraid they would miss the train to Paris if they delayed a minute longer. "We must go," said Gabrielle, rising with an effort, and as she rose, leaning on both Florence and Roger. "Why so?" asked Roger. Madame de Monterey shook her head. "This place is too near to our house of sorrows." "Suppose we all go," said Emilienne. "There is another later train to night. Florence and I have hardly unpacked anything. We can pack up again almost immediately." "You are right," said Gabrielle. "Never let us part from one another. Let us go together and find some new abode where we may live the new life now before us." At midnight, in a rain which seemed to harmonize with the sorrows connected with their 15 years' residence in that part of the country, the two mothers and their two children got upon the train. They carried with them a secret holy joy, one might almost say a most sweet sadness. Halfway to Paris, the engaged pair, looking at the heavens, saw stars appearing in the sky. They reached Paris in the early morning. The dawn was chilly and rather pale, but it promised a fine day. It was a foreshadowing of their afterlives, which at their dawn had been cheerless and watered by tears. But their day was about to open into the warmth and brightness of youthful happiness. For before the sun of their life rose, they had been trained to duty and initiated into sorrow, the two things that make love deep and lasting after marriage. End of chapter 18. Recording by Deanna Beauvais. End of For 15 Years by Louis Ulbach. Translated by Elizabeth Wormley Latimer.